Hello DevFest Zambia, I'm Maya. This is my talk from idea to app, jumpstart into Android Dev with Compose. So the intention of this talk is to provide you with a map and some resources that when someone tells you, can you build this app for me, you will have the resources to be able to explore this and build an app yourself. There will also be a deep dive into the Compose UI system, just so we can get orientated on how to build a UI with Compose. If you want to access these slides, you can find them at this link. So what ingredients do we need if we want to build an app on Android? Well, first off, we'll need some time and patience. This is probably the most important ingredient to be able to complete your app. Then you'll need a pencil and paper, and this is so that you can scratch your ideas down and get an idea of what your app should be doing and how your user interface looks. And also you can use the pencil and paper to test your ideas before you build anything. And then you need a computer and the internet. This will be a computer that can run Android Studio, on which you can actually build the app. It doesn't have to be a Mac, it can be a Windows machine, and you don't need the internet all of the time. You just need it to download the resources, and you need it when you need to research some information. Then you can have a device to test on, but this is optional because you can use an Android Studio emulator. And then once you've built your app and you've tested your app and you're ready to launch it on the Play Store, then only do you need some money. So it costs $25 to once off to register on Google Play. And again, if you need the slides, there's the QR code for the slides. So here is the map. So this, I drew a picture of the whole process. So here you are, you've got an idea for an app, and now how do you get from this idea all the way to this green block, which is the ship block where you're actually shipping your app? So these are the steps that are in between. So first off, you have to think about what it is that you want to build. What is the idea? What is the app going to do? How will it work? Now these steps look like they happen in sequence, but if you need to at any time, you can loop back and jump back to an earlier step. This is just so I can fit it on the paper. So the first thing you need to do is you need to think about how you want to build your app and what it is that you actually want to build. And then it's a good idea to have a system overview of how will your app fit in with the internet, how will your app fit in with one user, multiple user, how will the system work as an overview. Then you need to make some decisions on what language you want to use, what stack you want to use, what backend you want to use. So this is why this is a blue block, and it has some decision choices. And part of this decision-making process, you'll have to learn about the different technologies so that you can make the best choice for your solution. Then you get to this blue block, which is you build the app and you build the backend together. Once you've got something working, this doesn't have to be complete, you can test it. At that point, you could potentially ship it already, but you could probably test it and loop back and change and fix and make your app as good as possible. Once you've tested it and you've decided to ship it to the Play Store, you'll be monitoring your app and seeing what your users are doing with your app. At this point, you'll be learning some more, and you might make some more changes, and you'll test it again before you ship it to the Play Store. What also might happen is that you would be monitoring your app, and then you'll find out something that you missed. You might be doing some more design on paper, and then you'll flow right back through the whole process. So this is the overview, but now we're going to break down into pieces the different sections and have a look at what each section entails. We are going to focus more extra time on the build app on the Android side to have a look at Compose. So the first section is when you're moving from the idea that you have in your head, I want to build something, to what your design is and what your overview is. And that is in this section of the map that I've given you. So there are two kinds of processes that I could find that Google uses to do this exact step. Now, your process doesn't have to be as complicated as this. Your process, if it's a small and a simple app, or if you're building an app just because you want to learn something, can just be you drawing a few things on a piece of paper. And the other thing I want to point out here is that all of the slides have links to the different resources. So you'll see at every single point in the slides, there are links. And if you download the slides, you can get the links to all of these processes. Now, the Google Sprint process that they use to research what the idea is of the app is called a research sprint. And what they do is they have the idea, they build some other prototype, they test it out with actual people, and then they repeat until they've got the idea of what they want their app to do very clear in their mind. This looks complicated. They say it takes 4 days, but in your case, it could be as simple as drawing a picture of what you think your app looks like and what you think your app wants to do, and then taking it to some people, 2 people, 3 people, and then having them pretend to use the app and see if they can understand why you want to build the app, what the value proposition of the app is, and if they would use the app. So this doesn't have to be complicated, but it is a very vital step right in the beginning, because if you figure out what it is your app needs to do before you even start coding, you're going to save a lot of coding time. Then the other sprint process that Google uses is called a design sprint, and this is more around the visual design of the screens, and their steps are you understand what you want, you define what you want, you sketch out a prototype, make some decisions, and then with your prototype you validate. And that's very similar to this building a prototype. The goal here is to figure out the design of your app. The goal here is to figure out what does the app do and what is the app's value proposition. And after you've spent some time thinking about this and writing these things down, you will have answers to some of the following questions. You might have answers to more questions, but you'll have answers to who are your target customers, what are their characteristics, what problems and needs and motivations do the people have. So what problem are you solving, and what is your value proposition for your specific app? You might also at this point have some paper designs of what you think your app is going to look like and what the flows are through your app. And this is, you haven't even touched a computer yet. You can do this all with a pencil and the paper that we had as our first ingredient. And then once you have all of this clear in your mind, you'll understand where your app is relative to your users. Will there be one user? Will there be many users? How will the app interact with the internet? And is there any data that needs to be stored locally? So you'll have a good idea of what your global picture is of how your app works. Now we're on the step where you've got to make some choices about your frameworks and how you want to build things, and you need to learn and build. And this is the section I'm focusing specifically on the front end. And we're here in our map. We're at this decision block where we have to make decisions on languages and the stack, and we're learning and we're building the app. So for the front end, there might be some questions. You might be thinking, should I use Android or should I be using iOS? Do I need any web? Do I need desktop? Am I going to use Dart or Kotlin? Should I be using Flutter or Kotlin multi-platform? Do I use Swift UI? Do I use Compose, or should I be using Flutter? Oh, I think I'm probably not going to be using Views. So for this talk, I've narrowed this down, and I'm going to be focusing on Android and on Kotlin and on Compose. But that doesn't necessarily exclude iOS, web, or desktop, because if you choose Kotlin multi-platform, you'll be able to use Compose and you'll be able to ship to Android or iOS. These decisions are often based on what you want to learn. And why I say this is because it's important to be passionate about what you're learning. And if you're excited to learn either Dart, say, or Kotlin or whatever, then you're going to have a much better time learning new technology to build your app. So, for an Android app, if you're using Kotlin, Google has some architecture guidelines. And these architecture guidelines aren't set in stone, but they're really useful for when you're learning how an app works and if you want to put things together. And typically, there is the data layer. So the data layer has got nothing to do with the UI. The data layer just either collects from the internet or collects from a local database and provides the data that your app needs to be displaying to your user and the data that the user then changes. There's a domain layer that's optional, and this is just if you find that you have business logic or logic in your app that you want to reuse, or you have some areas of your app that's, say, pure Kotlin, but it's complicated, then you can split it out so that it's in the data layer, so it doesn't get muddled with the data layer and it doesn't get muddled with the UI layer. Now, the UI layer is the place where the user interacts. And here, what you will do is you'll take whatever data comes from the data layer, gets manipulated by the domain layer potentially, and here you will present the data in a way that the UI can show it to the user. And over here as well, the user will be inputting some actions, might be pressing some buttons, and this change will propagate up into the data layer and potentially change something on the internet. If you need more information, there's an architecture link, and there's also the Now and Android sample app that has all these layers perfectly explained. Now, it's a good idea to visualize these layers when you're building your app and to try and keep some kind of separation, because it will help you later when you need to test or when your app grows big. So now is the time that we're going to have a look at Jetpack Compose. So we all have an Android app. We know how it works. It's a phone, it's a device. The user can touch the screen, change things, and the app fetches something from the internet. Maybe it has it in a local storage. So here the cupcake is the data coming through, saying what the user wants to have a look at, and the hand here is a user interaction. This app is one of the sample Compose apps that it's called JetSnack, that you can find on the internet. So if you want to build anything that looks like this, you can find all of this open source code for JetSnack. So an important concept in Compose is this idea of state that flows to the UI, and then an event changes the state. So what this means is that the state, like whether we're showing a cupcake or not, flows into the UI. The UI just displays what's in the state. So the state has got some data, and the UI simply displays what the state of the data is. If the user now clicks on something, the UI layer will pass that event back up, and the state might change. But the UI layer doesn't consume the event over here and then sneakily changes the state over here. The flow is always like this, so that there's no way that this state that comes in from the network or from your database can be out of sync with what your UI is showing. If the UI always shows the state, then there will never be anything that's out of sync with what the UI thinks the state is and what the state really is. So now, if you think again to those architecture layers, we've got the repository, which is in the data layer here. And the job of the repository is to take the data from the network or the data from the database and figure out which is the most valid one and present that down. There could be a domain layer in here, but I've skipped the domain layer for now. And in Android world, if you're using the standard Jetpack libraries, you could have a view model that holds the state, and the view model picks up the events and then can pass any changes it needs back to the repository. So we have a view model here that holds the state. And again, we've got the state diagram. So the state is flowing from the top down to the UI, and then the user would interact with the UI, and then the events would flow back up. So in Android, there is typically an activity or a fragment. You need at least one activity because that's the thing that's going to show on the screen. You don't need a fragment if you're using Compose. I'll show you in the code now in a moment how to do that. And one way to connect your activity with your view model is using live data. And so this is where Compose comes in. So Compose is here in the activity. You access Compose and you start running the Compose UI system, and you build up your UI with different functions in Compose, and you hook your view model into your Compose. And that's how the state comes into your UI and the events go up out of your UI. So the basics of Compose. Compose is built up of a tree of functions. So these shapes are functions, and then the state comes into the function as a parameter. And these functions are nested, so they're nested functions, and that's how you can build up quite a complex UI system. And some of these functions can be these composables. We call these functions composables. They can be stateful, so they can have state inside. Or some of them are stateless, so that means that they get all of their state as their parameters. How this would look in Compose is if you want to have a composable function, you use this @composable annotation. The convention is to have a capital letter for the function name, some state comes in, but then what you can't see here, because of this @composable function, this is a compiler plugin that inserts another parameter over here. And the parameter that gets inserted over here is the composer. And the composer knows about all the state. And the composer can recompose or redraw the screen. And the composer takes these functions don't return anything, but the composer takes all of these functions and it emits the UI. It in fact makes the UI appear on the screen through the Compose libraries. So now, after we've learned about Compose, and we know what our app wants to do, we've got an idea of what the screen looks like, only now is the right time to open up Android Studio and to run the wizard and generate a starter app. So I'm not going to show you that because you can try that in your own time. But when you open up your starter app, the thing that you look for is the main activity. So the main activity is the activity that is going to show your UI on the state. And then inside the main activity, there is typically an onCreate method. Now the onCreate method is where the main activity starts for the first time. And inside onCreate, you'll see that there is, if you've chosen the Compose wizard starting screen, you'll see that there is a set content method with a lambda over here, and inside these curly braces here you can do any of the Compose components. So from this point on, you are in Compose world and you can use composables. And here we meet our first composable. It is the text composable, and this text composable will just write hello world on the screen. So now, what kind of things can we put onto our screen? What kind of components can we have on our UI? So here are just some examples. You can have text, which will just place a text. You could have a button that takes an onClick, and inside the button is just text that says click me. You could have a spacer, but there are many more components. There are some basic components, but there's a whole catalog of components you can choose from. So on the basic Compose components was built the material components, and the material components could be material 2 or material 3. There's a material Android catalog app that will show you all of the different components you can use. And this material Android catalog app is also open source. So you can see exactly the code for each of the components that you want to place on the screen. Now, where would we put these components? So how do you control where the components go on the screen? So if you know anything about Android view coding, you'll know about linear layouts and nesting linear layouts and frame layouts. In Compose, we don't have those. In Compose, we've got 3 basic layouts. We've got a box layout, which allows you to put these texts and these buttons and these components in a box like this. This is similar to the frame layout, but you can say where you want the component, if you want it in the beginning, in the middle, or in the corners, and you can also control like which component gets drawn first. The other option is a row layout, which will place the components in a row. And the other option is a column layout. You can also have lazy layouts, and you can have your own custom layouts, but you can build probably almost anything using these basic layouts. The good thing about Compose is that you can nest these layouts. So if you want to build a complex layout, which has maybe an avatar picture and a title and a list of things, you can nest these layouts in each other, and it's not the same problem you used to have with the Android view system, because this is just Compose and it's not building any objects. You can safely nest these different layouts. So now we know what we can place on the screen. We know how we can place it on the different screen. Now we might want to customize our components and our screens, and you do the customizations with either themes or modifiers. Now let's look at modifiers first. Now a modifier is something that you want to apply to a composable. So here we have a row composable, or we have a button composable, or a column composable. But say we want to change the padding. Now padding is something that applies to different composables. And so the way that Compose does is they take in a modifier, and a modifier has all of the different things that you could want to change. So for instance, this row is going to fill max width. It's going to fill the maximum of the screen, and it's going to have a padding of 8. And then in here would be what's inside the row. Or this button is going to be a specific square 56 dp button, but it's going to have a padding of 8. So you can see these are the reusable kinds of modifications you would want to do on your composables, and you pass these in with a modifier. And here you can see a column, and I'm changing the background color to light gray here. So you can see there are lots of different kinds of modifiers you can apply, and there's a link with a list of all the modifiers. One thing to notice though, these modifiers get applied in sequence, so the order of this matters. It matters if you put padding after full max width or before full max width. And if you go to the links, you'll find more information about how this works. The other way that you can change what your UI looks like is if you use a theme. Now, a theme will change the color, the typography, and the shape used over an entire app or an entire section of the app. And how you apply a theme is you wrap your composable screen. So this My Custom Screen is a complex set of composables all together. And if you wrap a composable in a theme, the theme values for, say, the color and the typography and the shape will be available all the way through to your whole of your app and will change all of the components in your app. There are two flavors of themes provided. The one is Material 2 and the other one is Material 3. Material 2 is older, so there's a recommendation to use Material 3, but also you could probably build your own custom design, and there's a link how to build your own custom design. Now I want to jump just briefly into the kinds of choices and things you need to do for the backend. So we're here in our diagram, we're still making some decisions, we've figured out how we want the front end to do, but we want to quickly look at the backend. Now, the backend, working with the backend is a huge topic. It depends a bit on if you're using an existing backend or if you're building your own backend from scratch. But if you're just playing around or starting out, I would propose you have a serious look at Firebase, because Firebase is a lot of out-of-the-box free backend support that you can use and build in your app, and you don't need to have a dedicated backend build for an initial project and a startup project. And this is really good if you don't know if your project is going to be successful or not. So the kinds of questions that you need to ask about backend is: who's going to build it? Do you need to build it? Is someone else building it? Are you using an existing system? What are the requirements? And again, if you don't know any of this, if you just know what kind of backend information you want, Firebase is a good option to look at, because it's got a real-time database that you can use to store some data. It's got some user authentication, which means you can have multiple users and you can allow them to log in. It's got some push notifications out of the box, and it's got some remote config, which will allow you to have some users have some kind of functionality that's different to others. The docs for that is here in this link. There's a console, there's a Firebase console, and you will connect your project to the Firebase console. And this Spark plan that you can try out will give you some limits, but will allow you to try out all of these features for free. So the next thing that I do want to mention, I'm not going into detail, is the fact that you need to think about how you want to test and how you want to monitor your app so that you can know what's happening, because Android apps are in the wild in people's hands and you're not even near, the developer isn't even near the app. So there's no way to know what's happening unless you're either testing before you ship or you're monitoring your app in the field. And so we're over here, we're in this part of the map. Here we are with test and monitor. This is after you've built something with Firebase potentially and with Compose. Just going to give you a quick overview, and the intention of this slide is really to give you some words so that when you get to this part of your process that you know what you want to search for and what you know what are the things that you can learn about. For Android specifically, I could show you the test pyramid with the unit tests and the integration tests, But for Android, for me, I think it's most useful to think about testing in two different ways. There's basically, if you think there's a divide here, there's two kinds of areas of testing. There's JVM testing. This means you can test it on your laptop, or you can test it on a CI system. And the kinds of tests that you would do here are, if you've got automated unit tests or automated integration tests, if you've got some UI testing using screenshots that can run on the JVM, if maybe you're using Roboelectric. The benefit of these tests are they run quickly and you don't need a phone or an emulator to do the tests. On the other side are the device or emulator tests. Now, these are for things that are Android specific, like database or Android specific things. And so if you want to have the bulk of your tests be running quickly and on the JVM, it would be a good idea to split it out so that the things that are Android specific or hardware specific are in a separate layer. So that, remember, we had the layers of the architecture. You can test the layers themselves separately, which will allow you to get better test coverage. Some other device or emulator testing would be manual testing, like if you physically take the phone and you test manually. Exploratory testing, which is part of manual testing, where you're just trying the app out and you're not even using any test cases to see how the app works. UI tests may be running on Firebase Test Lab and using Espresso Library. Then for monitoring, again, Firebase is a good option for this. You can build in Crashlytics into your app, and this will track the crashes. So if people are experiencing crashes that you're not experiencing, you'll be able to see where their app crashes. You could add Google Analytics to see which features your users are using and how they're using your app. And Firebase also provides performance monitoring, so you can see if your app is getting stuck somewhere and causing jank. And at this point now, you've thought about your app, you've designed your app, you've built your app, you've made some front-end and back-end decision, you've added some tests, you're monitoring your app. At this point, you could be ready to ship your app. So we are finally in the final green block of the map. So just briefly an overview, if you're going to be shipping to Google Play, I would make a special email for your developer account and you register your developer account, and this is where you need the $25. Then you need to set up your app and your store listing with the screenshots and the description of what your app is. You need to build a release version. Here's the link of how to build your release version. You upload your APK. You do some tests and you monitor. Now, this test step is new because Google is requiring us to have our test in the test track and test it first before we can take it live. And that's a new requirement that's just come up. But there's a link on what this is. And it just means that you need to have 20 people test your app before you can take it live. And once you've done this and you have your app on Google Play, you will see that there's a whole dashboard in Google Play where you can actually start monitoring and having a look and seeing how your app performs in the wild. So that's it. Well done. This is the whole path from thinking about an app to deciding how to build an app to doing some UI in Compose and then finally shipping your app. And again, if you need the links, if you need the slides, you can find it at this link using this QR code. Thank you. Have a lovely DevFest further.